Sometimes the people everyone ignores are the ones who deserve to be seen the most. The afternoon air felt heavy outside Lincoln Elementary as parents gathered near the front entrance waiting for their children. Cars rolled slowly through the pickup lane. Teachers chatted near the doors. Everything looked normal. Then Sophie Carter stepped onto the sidewalk. The 9-year-old girl adjusted the hearing aid behind her ear and held her sketchbook tightly against her chest. Drawing was her favorite thing in the world. Whenever life felt difficult, she filled blank pages with color and imagination. Most kids her age carried backpacks full of books. Sophie carried dreams. A few students standing near the bike rack noticed her immediately. Their whispers began before she even reached the gate. Sophie lowered her eyes. She had heard those whispers before. She knew what they meant. Even with limited hearing, she understood the looks, the pointing, the laughter that always seemed to follow her. She tried to keep walking, one careful step after another. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today they would leave her alone. Instead, the laughter grew louder. Several parents turned their heads. A teacher glanced over, then quickly looked away. Sophie's shoulders tightened. Her fingers wrapped around the edge of her sketchbook. She wanted to disappear. Across the street, Emily Carter rushed out of a small diner carrying a takeout bag. Her shift had ended only minutes earlier. She was exhausted after 10 straight hours on her feet, but none of that mattered. Seeing her daughter always made the long days worthwhile. Then she noticed Sophie's expression. The smile vanished from her face. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Emily dropped the bag onto a nearby bench and hurried toward the school entrance. Her heart pounded harder with every step. Sophie stood frozen while several students surrounded her. No one touched her. No one needed to. Their words alone were enough to make her feel alone in a crowd. Emily reached her daughter and immediately wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Sophie looked up, her blue eyes filled with hurt she was trying desperately to hide. "Mom," she signed softly, her hands trembling. "Why do they always look at me like that?" Emily felt a sharp ache in her chest. She wanted to tell her daughter everything would be okay. She wanted to promise the world would become kinder. Yet the truth sat heavily inside her. She didn't know when things would change. She only knew she would never stop protecting her child. As silence settled over the crowd, someone stood watching from farther down the sidewalk. A tall man in a dark suit. Calm, unmoving. Nobody seemed to recognize him. His eyes never left Sophie and Emily. While everyone else looked away from their pain, he continued watching. Thoughtfully, intently, almost as if he had just witnessed something he could not ignore. At that moment, neither Emily nor Sophie had any idea that this stranger was about to change both of their lives forever. That evening, long after the school parking lot had emptied, Emily and Sophie sat together inside their small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The building was old. The kitchen faucet dripped every few minutes. A faint hum from the aging air conditioner filled the silence. Still, Emily had worked hard to make the place feel like home. Family photos covered one wall. Sophie's drawings covered another. Bright colors brought life to spaces that money could not improve. Sophie sat at the kitchen table sketching quietly while Emily sorted through a stack of bills. Rent, utilities, medical expenses, school supplies. The numbers never seemed to stop growing. Emily rubbed her forehead and took a slow breath. She had spent years trying to stay ahead, yet every month felt like another uphill climb. Across the table, Sophie glanced up from her drawing. Even after everything that had happened outside the school, she was trying to smile. That was what broke Emily's heart the most. Her daughter never stopped trying to see the good in people. "What are you drawing?" Emily asked gently. Sophie turned the page around. It showed a beautiful lighthouse standing beside the ocean beneath a sky filled with stars. Emily smiled immediately. "That is incredible." Sophie signed back. "The lighthouse helps people find their way home." Emily felt her chest tighten. Sometimes she forgot how deeply her daughter saw the world. While other children noticed what was in front of them, Sophie seemed to notice what was hidden underneath. Later that night, after Sophie went to bed, Emily stepped onto the apartment balcony with a cup of coffee. The city lights stretched across the distance. Somewhere beyond those buildings were people living completely different lives. People who never worried about choosing between bills. People who never counted every dollar before visiting a grocery store. Emily looked up at the dark sky. She was tired. More tired than she wanted to admit. Yet quitting had never been an option. Sophie depended on her. Every extra shift, every missed vacation, Every sacrifice. It was all for her daughter. The next morning began before sunrise. Emily arrived at the diner just after 5 o'clock. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as customers slowly trickled inside. She moved from table to table with practiced efficiency, greeting guests with a warm smile even when her feet already ached. Around 8 o'clock, the front door opened. Emily barely looked up at first. Businessmen visited the diner all the time. This customer seemed no different. A tailored suit, expensive watch, calm expression. He chose a booth near the window and quietly reviewed documents while drinking black coffee. Several employees whispered among themselves. Something about him felt familiar. Emily did not pay attention. She had too much work to do. What she did not notice was that the man occasionally glanced in her direction. Not with pity, not with curiosity, with recognition. He remembered the woman from the school entrance. He remembered the little girl holding the sketchbook. Most of all, he remembered the look in Sophie's eyes. Before leaving, he placed cash on the table and walked toward the exit. Then he paused for a brief moment. His gaze settled on a framed employee photo hanging near the register. Beneath Emily's picture was a simple name tag. Emily Carter. The stranger nodded slightly before stepping outside. For the first time, he finally knew exactly who she was. Sophie had always spoken most clearly. Through her art. While other children filled notebooks with homework, she filled hers with entire worlds. The following Saturday morning, sunlight streamed through the apartment window as she sat at the kitchen table working on a new drawing. Colored pencils were spread around her like tiny treasures. Emily watched from across the room while folding laundry. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. No whispers, no judgment, no painful questions. Just a mother watching her daughter create something beautiful. Sophie carefully shaded the outline of a large city skyline. Above it, she drew a bright sunrise stretching across the horizon. Emily smiled. That one is special, isn't it? Sophie nodded. Then she sighed. It is about hope. Emily felt her eyes soften. Even after everything her daughter had experienced, she still believed in hope. That afternoon, Sophie learned that Lincoln Elementary would be hosting a citywide student art showcase in 3 weeks. The winning artwork would be displayed at the town cultural center for an entire year. Excitement immediately filled her face. Her teacher had often praised her creativity. Drawing was the one place where she never felt different from anyone else. She rushed home with the announcement and showed it to Emily. You should enter, Emily said without hesitation. Your work deserves to be seen. Sophie smiled, though uncertainty lingered behind her eyes. Do you think people will like it? She sighed. Emily gently squeezed her hand. The right people will. Over the next several days, Sophie poured herself into the project. Every afternoon after school, she sat at the kitchen table sketching, erasing, improving every detail. Her artwork showed a lighthouse standing beside a rocky coastline, while beams of light stretched across dark water toward distant boats. It was inspired by the drawing she had shown her mother earlier. To Sophie, the lighthouse represented kindness. The idea that someone could help others find their way even during difficult times. Meanwhile, life at school remained challenging. The students who often singled her out had not completely stopped. Their comments were subtle enough to avoid punishment, yet painful enough to leave scars. Sophie rarely responded. Instead, she focused on her art. She told herself that success would be the best answer. One afternoon, as students displayed their unfinished projects for feedback, several classmates gathered around Sophie's work. For a brief moment, she thought they might finally appreciate it. Instead, she noticed the smirks. The exchanged glances. One student quietly rolled his eyes. Another dismissed the drawing with a shrug before walking away. Sophie's excitement faded. By the time she reached home, her confidence had nearly disappeared. Emily immediately noticed. What happened? Sophie hesitated before signing. Maybe my art is not good enough. Emily sat beside her daughter and studied the lighthouse drawing carefully. Every line reflected patience. Every color carried emotion. It was remarkable. Listen to me, Emily said softly. Talent is not measured by the loudest voices in the room. Sophie looked down at the page. Emily continued. Sometimes people overlook something beautiful because they are too busy looking at themselves. Those words stayed with Sophie long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, miles away in a glass office overlooking the city, Ethan Blackwood reviewed a report before pausing unexpectedly. Resting on his desk was a photograph he had quietly requested earlier that week. It showed a young girl holding a sketchbook outside Lincoln Elementary. Ethan stared at the image for several seconds. Then his attention shifted to a note attached beside it. One line stood out immediately. Sophie Carter, student artist, exceptional talent. The closer the art showcase came, the more tension seemed to fill the halls of Lincoln Elementary. Posters announcing the event appeared on every bulletin board. Teachers encouraged students to finish their projects. Parents discussed the competition during pickup. For most children, it was simply another school activity. For Sophie, it felt much bigger. This was her chance to prove that her voice mattered, even if she expressed it differently than everyone else. Each afternoon, she returned home and added new details to the lighthouse painting. The ocean became richer with color. The sky glowed with shades of gold and blue. Tiny boats appeared in the distance, each one guided by the lighthouse beam. Emily often stood quietly beside the kitchen table, watching her daughter work. The painting seemed to grow more beautiful every day. One Tuesday afternoon, the school hosted a preview session where students could display their nearly completed projects. Families were invited to attend. Emily rearranged her work schedule to be there. She arrived wearing her diner uniform, still carrying the scent of coffee and fresh pastries. Sophie carefully placed her artwork on an easel near the center of the room. For a brief moment, pride replaced her usual nervousness. People stopped to look. Several parents complimented the painting. One teacher smiled warmly and called it inspiring. Sophie felt hope rising inside her. Then she overheard a conversation that changed everything. A woman standing nearby lowered her voice, though not enough. "The winner is probably already decided," she said. "Everyone knows whose family supports the school the most." Another parent nodded in agreement. Sophie did not fully understand what they meant, but Emily did. She recognized both women. Their children were among the students who often gave Sophie a difficult time. More importantly, their families were major donors to school programs. A strange feeling settled in Emily's stomach. Later that evening, after most guests had left, Sophie noticed that one student's project occupied a special display area near the entrance. Larger lights illuminated it. A printed description sat beside it in an expensive frame. Other projects, including hers, were arranged along the walls. Sophie tried not to think about it, but the difference was impossible to ignore. On the drive home, she stared quietly out the window. Streetlights passed one after another across the glass. Finally, she signed a question to her mother. "Do some people get extra chances because they have more money?" Emily tightened her hands around the steering wheel. The question felt far too mature for a 9-year-old child. "Sometimes life is not perfectly fair," she answered honestly. "But character matters more than status." Sophie nodded, though she seemed unconvinced. The next day brought another surprise. During lunch, her art teacher approached with an uneasy expression. She explained that several pieces, including Sophie's, would need additional review before final judging. No explanation followed. No clear reason was given. As other students celebrated their placement in the showcase, uncertainty suddenly surrounded Sophie's project. By afternoon, whispers spread through the school. Sophie sat alone in the art room staring at her lighthouse painting. For the first time since she started it, doubt crept into her heart. Somewhere across town, Ethan Blackwood received a call regarding preparations for the upcoming showcase. As the details were discussed, one particular name immediately caught his attention. Sophie Carter. Sophie tried to focus on schoolwork, but uncertainty followed her everywhere. The excitement she once felt about the art showcase had been replaced by questions nobody seemed willing to answer. Every time she looked at her lighthouse painting, she wondered whether it would ever receive a fair chance. Even so, she continued making small improvements. If there was one thing Emily had taught her, it was never to stop trying simply because the outcome seemed uncertain. Meanwhile, Ethan Blackwood found himself thinking about the young artist more often than he expected. During board meetings, business presentations, and charity discussions, her name kept returning to his mind. He had built one of the largest educational foundations in the state because he believed opportunity should never depend on wealth or connections. Yet something about Lincoln Elementary was beginning to concern him. Several reports crossing his desk hinted at favoritism within certain school programs. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough inconsistencies to raise questions. One afternoon, Ethan quietly requested additional information regarding the upcoming student showcase. His assistant seemed surprised. The event was relatively small compared to the projects his foundation normally supported. Still, Ethan wanted details. Participant lists, judging procedures, selection criteria. He reviewed everything personally. The more he read, the more uneasy he became. Back at school, Sophie received another discouraging update. Her teacher informed her that final evaluations had been delayed once again. Other students appeared to move through the process without obstacles. Only a handful of entries remained under review. Sophie's was one of them. She forced a smile and thanked her teacher politely, but disappointment followed her home. That evening, Emily noticed the change immediately. Sophie barely touched her dinner. The sparkle that usually appeared when discussing art had faded. "Talk to me," Emily said softly. Sophie hesitated before signing. What if they already decided who should win? Emily looked at her daughter carefully. It would have been easy to offer empty reassurance. Instead, she chose honesty. "You cannot control other people," she said. "You can only control who you become." Sophie listened quietly. Emily continued, "If someone overlooks your talent, that says something about them. It does not change who you are." The words brought a small smile back to Sophie's face. Not a complete one, just enough to keep hope alive. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. A representative from a local education foundation visited Lincoln Elementary. Teachers assumed the visit related to future grants. Administrators eagerly prepared presentations. Students barely noticed. Sophie certainly did not realize the visitor had been sent by Ethan himself. The representative spent hours observing classrooms, reviewing programs, and speaking with faculty members. He paid particular attention to the upcoming showcase. By the end of the visit, several concerns had been quietly documented. Patterns began emerging: preferential treatment, unequal promotion of certain projects, informal influence from a small group of affluent families. None of it was openly discussed, but the evidence continued growing. That evening, a detailed report landed on Ethan's desk. He read every page carefully. When he reached the section mentioning Sophie Carter's artwork, he stopped. Attached to the report was a photograph of the lighthouse painting. Ethan studied it in silence. The image carried emotion far beyond the work of an average child. Hope, courage, persistence, everything the showcase was supposed to celebrate. Slowly, he set the report down. Then he made a decision. For the first time since noticing Sophie outside the school, he was no longer willing to remain a distant observer. The week before the showcase became the hardest one Sophie had faced all year. Every morning she walked into Lincoln Elementary, hoping for good news. Every afternoon, she returned home, carrying more uncertainty. Final participant announcements had been posted throughout the school, yet her artwork remained listed as pending review. Other students excitedly discussed display locations and judging schedules. Sophie smiled when they spoke to her, but inside she felt herself slipping further from the confidence she once had. One rainy afternoon, she sat quietly beside the apartment window, watching water slide down the glass. Her lighthouse painting rested on the table nearby. For the first time since she started it, she could not bring herself to pick up a pencil. Emily noticed immediately. The silence in the room felt heavier than usual. "You have not worked on your painting today," she said gently. Sophie stared toward the window for several seconds before signing. "Maybe there is no point anymore." The words hit Emily harder than she expected. Her daughter had always been hopeful. Hearing that hope begin to fade was painful. Emily moved closer and sat beside her. "Do not let other people decide your worth," she said softly. Sophie looked down at her hands. "What if they already have?" she signed back. Emily wished she had an easy answer. Instead, she wrapped an arm around her daughter and simply sat with her for a moment. Sometimes comfort mattered more than solutions. The following day brought another disappointment. Emily received a call from the school requesting a meeting. She arrived after finishing her diner shift, still wearing her uniform. Inside the office, administrators spoke politely, but their message left her uneasy. They explained that certain entries required additional evaluation. Standards. They discussed procedures, guidelines, and committee reviews. Yet none of their explanations truly answered the question Emily cared about most. Why was Sophie being treated differently? When she asked directly, the room grew noticeably uncomfortable. No one provided a clear response. Emily left frustrated. Outside, She sat alone in her car, gripping the steering wheel. For the first time, she considered whether transferring Sophie to another school might be necessary. The thought broke her heart. That evening she tried to hide her worries, but Sophie sensed them immediately. Children often notice things adults believe they concealed. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and growing concerns. Exhaustion pressed against her from every direction. She wondered how much longer she could keep fighting battles that never seemed to end. Across town, Ethan Blackwood reviewed the latest findings from his independent inquiry. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Sophie's project had received some of the highest evaluation scores from qualified reviewers. Despite that, repeated delays had prevented her from advancing through the process normally. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared out at the city skyline. The situation was no longer merely concerning. It was unacceptable. Meanwhile, unaware of everything happening behind the scenes, Sophie stood in her bedroom looking at the lighthouse, painting one final time before bed. A single thought lingered in her mind. If even her best effort was not enough, perhaps she should stop believing that things could ever change. The morning of the final review meeting arrived beneath clear blue skies, yet Sophie felt none of the optimism that usually came with a bright day. She walked through the school doors carrying her sketchbook against her chest, but the excitement that once filled her steps had almost disappeared. Around her, students talked eagerly about the showcase scheduled for the following week. Names had been announced. Display assignments had been finalized. Everything seemed settled except one lingering question. What would happen to Sophie's painting? At the same time, Emily arrived at the diner before sunrise. She moved through her shift on instinct alone. Pour coffee. Take orders. Clear tables. Smile. Her mind remained somewhere else entirely. Every spare moment was filled with thoughts of her daughter. The uncertainty. The disappointment. The feeling that no matter how hard Sophie worked, someone always seemed ready to place another obstacle in her path. Shortly before noon, Emily received a message from the school requesting her presence at an afternoon administrative meeting regarding the showcase. Her stomach tightened immediately. The wording felt formal. Serious. She feared the worst. By 3 o'clock, she was seated inside a conference room at Lincoln Elementary. Several administrators occupied one side of the table. A few committee members sat nearby reviewing documents. Emily noticed the tension in the room right away. Something unusual was happening. Before anyone could begin, the conference room door opened. Every conversation stopped. A tall man entered wearing a charcoal suit and carrying a thin folder. The reaction around the table was immediate. Expressions changed. Postures straightened. Even the principal seemed caught off guard. Emily recognized him at once. He was the same stranger she had seen outside the school weeks earlier. The man who had quietly watched from a distance while everyone else looked away. He took a seat near the end of the table. Calm, composed, completely in control. The principal cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwood, we were not expecting you personally. Emily blinked. The name sounded familiar. Then realization hit her. Ethan Blackwood, founder of one of the largest educational foundations in the state. The businessman whose charitable programs supported schools throughout the region. A wave of surprise swept through the room. Ethan offered a polite nod. I wanted to attend this discussion myself. His voice remained steady, but there was unmistakable authority behind every word. The meeting began. Administrators explained procedures. They described evaluation standards and review policies. Ethan listened without interruption. Occasionally he glanced down at the folder in front of him. When they finally finished, silence settled across the room. Then Ethan opened the folder. Interesting, he said quietly. Because the independent evaluations tell a very different story. Several people exchanged nervous looks. Emily sat frozen. She had no idea what was happening. Ethan continued. According to multiple qualified reviewers, Sophie Carter's artwork ranked among the strongest submissions in the showcase. The room became completely silent. Yet her project experienced repeated delays that cannot be justified by the documented criteria. No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time, Emily saw uncertainty appear on the faces of people who had always seemed so confident. Ethan closed the folder and looked around the table. I believe every student deserves a fair opportunity, he said. Do we all agree on that? One by one, heads slowly nodded. The balance of power had shifted. Everyone in the room could feel it. The silence inside the conference room seemed to stretch forever after Ethan's question. Every administrator understood that the conversation had moved beyond routine procedures. Facts were now replacing assumptions. Records were replacing explanations. Emily sat quietly, hardly believing what she was hearing. For weeks, she had felt powerless. For weeks, every concern had been brushed aside with polite responses and vague promises. Now, for the first time, someone with real influence was asking the questions she had been unable to make anyone answer. Ethan opened the folder again and carefully reviewed several pages. Independent evaluators scored Sophie Carter's artwork among the highest entries submitted this year, he said. The review notes repeatedly describe originality, emotional depth, and exceptional artistic ability. Several committee members lowered their eyes toward the table. Ethan continued, "Can anyone explain why a project receiving such evaluations remained delayed while other submissions advanced normally?" No immediate answer came. The principal adjusted several papers in front of him before finally speaking. His voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. He referenced procedural concerns, additional reviews, administrative discretion, yet the explanation sounded weak even to those listening. Ethan listened patiently. Then he placed another document on the table. These records show that no comparable delays occurred for other projects receiving similar scores. The room fell silent again. Facts left very little room for argument. Meanwhile, across campus, Sophie remained unaware of the meeting unfolding around her. She sat alone in the art room, finishing the final details of her lighthouse painting. Sunlight filtered through the windows. Dust drifted through the air. Her pencil moved carefully across the paper. Although she had almost lost hope, a small part of her still believed the painting mattered. She just wished someone else could see what she had tried so hard to express. Back in the conference room, the discussion continued. Ethan never raised his voice. He never accused anyone directly. Instead, he relied on evidence. Evaluation forms, timelines, written observations. One by one, inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Eventually, a committee member quietly acknowledged that external influences may have affected certain decisions. Another admitted concerns had been raised earlier but never properly addressed. The admissions were small, yet significant. Emily watched in disbelief. The truth she had sensed for months was finally emerging into the open. By the end of the meeting, a unanimous decision had been reached. Sophie's artwork would immediately receive a full, independent review under the same standards applied to every other student. More importantly, the showcase process itself would undergo additional oversight. Ethan closed his folder and stood. The tension in the room had changed completely. Fear had been replaced by accountability. Before leaving, he turned toward Emily. It was the first time they had spoken directly. "Your daughter is remarkably talented," he said. Emily struggled to find words. "Thank you," she finally managed. Ethan offered a small smile. She earned this opportunity herself. As he walked toward the door, Emily felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Relief. Not because every problem had been solved. Not because life had suddenly become easy. Relief because someone had finally looked past appearances and recognized the truth. Later that evening, as Sophie carefully packed away her art supplies, a phone call arrived at the Carter apartment. The school administration had an important update regarding the showcase. One that would change everything. The phone call arrived just after dinner. Emily answered with cautious optimism, afraid to hope too much after everything they had endured. As the conversation continued, her eyes slowly widened. When she finally lowered the phone, Sophie immediately searched her mother's face for answers. For several seconds, Emily could not speak. Emotion caught in her throat. Then she smiled. A real smile. The kind Sophie had not seen in weeks. "Your painting has been officially approved for the showcase," she said. Sophie's eyes filled with disbelief. "Really?" she sighed. Emily nodded. "Really?" For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Sophie threw her arms around her mother. Months of frustration, uncertainty, and disappointment seemed to dissolve inside that simple embrace. The following week, the City Cultural Center buzzed with excitement as families, students, teachers, and community leaders gathered for the annual showcase. Bright displays filled the large exhibition hall. Artwork lined the walls beneath carefully arranged lighting. Conversations echoed through the room. Cameras flashed. Visitors moved from display to display, admiring the students' creativity. Sophie stood near the entrance holding her mother's hand. She felt nervous, not because she doubted her painting anymore. She simply could not believe she was finally there. Then she saw it. Her lighthouse painting displayed prominently in the center section of the exhibit. Soft lighting illuminated every detail. The ocean, the sky, the beam of hope stretching across the water. Visitors stopped to study it. Some lingered longer than others. Several read the artist's statement beside the display. Many smiled. One elderly woman quietly wiped away a tear. Sophie stared in amazement. For the first time, people were seeing what she had always hoped they would see. Not her hearing challenges, not her differences, her talent. As the evening continued, judges completed their final evaluations. Students gathered anxiously while families waited nearby. Eventually, the announcement ceremony began. The room gradually fell silent. Names were called. Awards were presented. Then came the final recognition for artistic excellence. The presenter paused before reading the winner. This year's selection reflects extraordinary creativity, emotional depth, and a powerful message of hope. Sophie felt her heart racing. The award goes to Sophie Carter. For a second, she thought she had misunderstood. Then the audience erupted into applause. Emily covered her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. Sophie stood frozen. The entire room rose to its feet. People who had never met her applauded with genuine admiration. Teachers smiled proudly. Community leaders nodded with approval. Even students who once overlooked her now watched with respect. As Sophie walked toward the stage, she noticed someone standing near the front row. Ethan Blackwood. He applauded along with everyone else. Not as a billionaire. Not as a powerful businessman. Simply as someone who believed talent deserved a fair chance. After the ceremony, Ethan approached Emily and Sophie. He congratulated the young artist personally and announced that his foundation would sponsor a special youth arts scholarship in her name. Sophie looked at her mother, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Months earlier, she had wondered whether anyone would ever truly see her. Tonight, she had her answer. Standing beneath the bright lights of the cultural center, surrounded by applause and encouragement, Sophie finally understood something important. The world had not changed because powerful people noticed her. The world changed because she never stopped shining, even when others refused to see her light.